basically, at the end of October, when we finished the synthesis report, we would have completed the fifth assessment cycle of the IPCC. And the IPCC is an organization that was established way back in 1988, essentially as a response to the growing concern that possibly human actions were influencing the climate of this planet. Now, scientists as far back as 150 years ago had postulated the impact of growing carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere and their influence on the climate of the Earth. But for a long period of time, this is an issue that perhaps did not get the attention of the policy community. So it was in '88 that the United Nations decided to set up the IPCC, but we're not a UN agency. We're an intergovernmental panel, and all our decisions are taken by consensus. So you can imagine you have 195 countries which are members of the IPCC, and not all of them, thank God, attend every meeting. But you have 130 plus countries very often. Sometimes they make mistakes. 132 of them elected me as chairman of the IPCC way back in 2002, and they compounded that mistake by re-electing me by acclamation in 2008. So here I am, and I finished my second term by sometime next year. And that means I would have been responsible for overseeing two particular assessments of the IPCC. I'll say a little more about the process by which we bring out our assessments, but let me start by essentially highlighting something that Einstein, a person who was perhaps the most brilliant scientist we've had in the world, but more than that, also a human being with an enormous vision of things that went far beyond science, said very eloquently, he said, problems cannot be solved at the same level of awareness that created them. Today, fortunately, we have the benefit of knowledge and awareness on the basis of which, if we all decide, we can solve this problem. It is within our reach, and that's one of the points that I'd like to convey at the end of my presentation. Now, the Working Group 1 report essentially deals with the physical science basis of climate change. And there are some very profound findings that we came up with, which I'll just run through with you. 95% certainty that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. And we use the term extremely likely, that it's extremely likely that human actions have been responsible for most of the warming that has taken place since the middle of the last century. And when we use the term extremely likely, it conveys a probability of over 95%. In the previous assessment, we made a similar statement, but we said very likely, and that represents a probability of over 90%. So therefore, in the period of these 6 years since the last report came out, and the one that we brought out, this Working Group 1 report, which came out in September of last year, we have been able to arrive at a much higher level of confidence on the link between human actions and changes in the climate. And since the 50s, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. So what is really significant is the fact that human activities have influenced the climate of this planet in a very short period of time and in a very intensive way, which is totally out of the trend that you have seen over millennia. And this trend was essentially that of a fairly stable climate. Of course, there are always fluctuations in the weather. There are fluctuations in temperature, which are the result of a whole range of drivers. But what's particularly important is the fact that we have affected the trend. And this trend is something that would lead to impacts, which I'll elaborate on in a little while. The limited climate change will require sustained and substantial reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, here you see changes in temperature that have taken place since the beginning of industrialization converted into decadal values. And you find that the last 3 decades have been the warmest, successively warmer than the previous ones. So, therefore, it is important for us to remember that this trend is clearly becoming far more pronounced. And in the last 3 decades, as you can see over here, the trend has been each decade being successively warmer than the previous one. And what has been the effect of this change in climate? Well, the oceans have warmed and risen, and that's because of thermal expansion of the oceans and the melting of all the bodies of ice across the globe. The amounts of snow and ice have diminished, sea level has risen, and the concentrations of greenhouse gases have increased in this period of time. What has been the extent of increase? Well, if you look at global average upper ocean heat content, as it happens, the oceans have been absorbing a large amount of the heat that's been generated as a result of anthropogenic increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases. Between 71 and 2010, about 90% of the energy accumulated has gone into the oceans. So as a result, the oceans have warmed significantly from the surface down to a depth of about 700 meters. And that warming is continuing because it's going to take several decades and perhaps centuries for the ocean to warm uniformly and go down to the depth, the deepest points of the oceans. So, in a sense, the oceans have taken up a lot of the heat that's been generated as a result of the forcings that have taken place due to the increase in the concentration of these gases. Or else, the surface of the earth would have been much warmer. And the rate of sea level rise since the mid-19th century has been larger than the mean rate during the previous 2 millennia. In fact, between the beginning of the last century and 2010, there's been a sea level increase of 19 centimeters. That's close to a foot. And you can imagine there are parts of the world which are low-lying coastal areas, there are small island states, and some of them are barely a meter above sea level. That means maybe a yard or a little more above sea level. And therefore, an increase of about a foot in the sea level is something that has implications even before you are faced with the danger of complete submergence. Why? Simply because every time there's a storm surge, every time there's coastal flooding, it's going to be that much more severe simply because the sea level is much higher. So these are manifestations of climate change which clearly we have to be concerned about. Now if you look at what the world is doing to deal with this problem, see the increase in carbon dioxide concentration. At the start of industrialization, we had 280 parts per million of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. In May of last year, it crossed the barrier of 400 parts per million. So there's been a huge increase in a very short period of time. And CO2 is not the only gas, there are other greenhouse gases also, the concentration of which has increased. And as the first fact over here mentioned in this particular slide tells you, these three, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, have increased to levels unprecedented in at least the past 800,000 years. And the ocean has absorbed 30% of the emitted anthropogenic carbon dioxide, and this has led to ocean acidification. Now that has serious implications simply because that's going to affect marine ecosystems, it's going to affect various forms of marine life. And to be honest, we really haven't studied this adequately. And we would have to get, the jury is still out, and we have to get much better scientific assessment of how this ocean acidification is going to affect everything that's below the ocean, not only living species, but also several ecosystems which obviously are going to be affected. And there's already evidence on coral reefs, for instance, which are being damaged and certainly affected by the impacts of ocean acidification. Then CO2 emissions from fossil fuels, combustion and industrial processes contributed about 78% of the total greenhouse gas emissions increased from 1970 to 2010. So these are two sources where there's been a very rapid increase, and we need to be concerned about that. If you look at other sources of emissions, here is a picture that tells you that, for instance, AFOLU stands for agriculture, forestry, and land use. That in itself accounts for almost a quarter of the emissions that are taking place, and that have taken place between 2000 and 2010. The others are, of course, industry, transport, energy, and so on. Economic growth and population increase have certainly been the important drivers of increase in CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion. And therefore, this is an area that we would have to focus on in bringing about mitigation. And these are expected to continue because otherwise we'll see, if we don't do anything about it, emissions will continue to grow and we would necessarily face much more severe impacts of climate change in the future. Continued emissions will lead to increase in warming of the oceans during the 21st century. And it's very likely that the Arctic sea ice cover will continue to shrink and thin as global mean surface temperature rises. I've been to the Arctic myself on a few occasions, and I'm going there again at the end of next month. And you get not only anecdotal information, but a whole lot of other data to show how Arctic sea ice cover is being affected. And we projected, as a matter of fact, that by 2050, September Arctic sea ice is likely to vanish. And September is the month when you have the lowest sea ice cover in the Arctic, simply because during the summer months there is some melting. But it's melting at such a rapid rate that by the middle of this century, you might see a complete absence of Arctic sea ice. And global glacier volume will further decrease. Global mean sea level will continue to rise during the 21st century. The other thing that is an issue to be concerned about is the increase in certain extreme events. The length, frequency, and or intensity of warm spells or heat waves will increase over most land areas. So much so that those heat waves, which currently take place once in 20 years in some parts of the world, will occur once in 2 years. So that obviously is a major change to which human society will have to adapt. And similarly, heavy precipitation events are on the increase both in frequency and intensity. And this will continue unless we bring about mitigation of greenhouse gases. Now, if you have these extreme precipitation events, there are several implications that we have to be concerned with. One is, of course, the fact that there would be a risk to life and property every time you get a heavy amount of rainfall or snowfall. There's clearly a threat to human as well as ecological systems. Because you'll have flooding, you'll have landslides, you'll have avalanches in the case of heavy snowfall, and that is clearly a threat. But more than that, there are implications in respect of availability of water. Because if, let's say, you've got a system where you've got stable and reasonably uniform rainfall during a certain period of time, if that's going to be replaced by sudden, sharp, and heavy periods of precipitation, then that has major implications for availability of water and our access to water resources. So these are issues that we need to keep in mind. I remember when I came through immigration yesterday, the immigration officer asked me what I was doing, and I told him. He says, but where is global warming? He said, we've had the coldest winter in this particular season, and I had to tell him that I never use the term global warming simply because it conveys the impression that all you're talking about is a warming of temperatures, but climate change is much wider. And what we are seeing is changes in the climate. And I told him, look, one season doesn't mean anything at all. You've got to look at the trend. So he stamped my passport and he let me. He just thought I was someone that he didn't want to have a conversation. So anyway. What are some of the other projected risks for natural systems of freshwater resources? There would be a significant reduction of renewable surface water and groundwater resources in most subtropical regions. Climate change is projected to pose risks to raw and drinking water quality. Terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, increased extinction risk under all warming scenarios, increased tree mortality, forest dieback with risks for ocean storage, biodiversity, wood production and economic activity, submergence and coastal flooding, erosion due to sea level rise. So, you know, there are a whole range of economic impacts that have economic and certainly ecological implications. Again, since I spend the best part of my life at airports or in sitting on planes, yesterday I saw on CNN there was a story about what's going to happen to coffee plantations across the globe, and this is something that I have personally studied myself. The impacts of climate change on coffee cultivation could be adverse, could be negative. And of course, the discussion on television was about how prices of coffee might go up. And this really means that perhaps we cut down on coffee consumption if we're confronted with higher prices, or maybe move to other substitutes. And I would recommend any specific substitute, it's your personal preference. Marine systems, redistribution and reduction of global marine species and biodiversity, the challenges for fisheries, because clearly with warming of the oceans, with changing of even the acidification content, you see in several parts of the world fish moving from their natural habitat to other locations where, you know, conditions will be more favorable and are getting more favorable for them. I remember a few years ago when I went to the Maldives Islands, which incidentally are a major exporter of tuna fish. They told me that they're just not getting the same catch that they used to, simply because a large part of that stock has moved. So, you know, there's going to be this kind of migration of species, and it's already happening. Expansion of dead zones with constraints for fish habitat, polar ecosystems and coral reefs at substantial risk, and so on.